because these guys are all pretty well known and you all know them. But I am going to nevertheless ask them to do like a 30-second update on who they are and what, besides marketing metrics, is occupying them these days when it comes to marketing. So, JP, maybe you want to go first on this.
Sure. So my name is JP Castlin, former consultancy executive, now independent consultant. Work primarily with strategic questions. So anything to do with strategy, I'm there. Also write a fair bit on the topic and deal with complexity, perhaps more so than most.
All right. Andrew?
Hi there. My name's Andrew Willshire. I have my own small company called Diametrical Limited. Yeah, I've worked in media for about the last 10 years, doing things like econometric modeling, building software tools, optimization, market modeling tools. Yeah, moving more into that sort of system design stuff, but still looking to help people with their data and make decisions off the back of it, make better decisions, hopefully. Yeah, all that kind of stuff, really.
Excellent. And Doug?
Yeah, I'm Doug Garnett. Primarily, I teach at Portland State University here. I teach in the marketing program and both teach intro to marketing and consumer behavior. But I kind of come more as almost a general businessman. Anyway, I'm writing a book right now, as the rest of my life, on issues around complexity. JP and I have some excellent discussions about that, and so I'm pretty deep in there. When it comes to metrics, I both have a couple degrees in math and spent a lot of time working in direct response forms of marketing, so I've got a lot of experience with metrics. Not all of it, a lot of it telling me so where are they really useful? And that's the that's kind of the key question.
Excellent, excellent. So then I do a little bit for me. If you go to orionx.net, you will see what we do. We focus on digital transformation, and I try to keep track of like a half a dozen technology trends. But also, I grew up as a marketing guy, so I'm highly interested in these things. So I'd like to just tee it up a little bit, and then we can go into a whole discussion phase. Well, what is it that needs untangling? And I was thinking about that, and what you obviously want is that business objectives lead to marketing objectives, and then you got marketing metrics that govern all of that. So really the question becomes, how do we make sure metrics do what they're supposed to do? And what are they supposed to do? How do we value things? How do we know that one thing is better than something else? How do they help us achieve business objectives or accelerate growth? How do they help us guide our strategy, figure out what the marketing mix should be? How do they help us adjust our actions and do more of something and less of something or none of something? And then, of course, a whole range of things is what can go wrong with metrics. And a lot can go wrong with metrics. And I expect that we'll probably spend a bunch of time just kind of talking about those things. Data can be inaccurate, it can be incomplete, it can be irrelevant, it can be irreproducible. And why is that? It could be it could be the visibility, like the data is not collected or the process is not instrumented. It could be the way you measure it, it could be the way you interpret it. And of course, all of that leads to a whole bunch of complexity in metrics and marketing that really bubbles right up to business complexity, which is also something that Doug and JP both mentioned. So with that, let's go kind of to our first topic, which is why do we need metrics when our instinct is so good? If data has all these problems with it, and hey, I've got N years of experience and I have gathered all this insight, so I should just be able to do the blink thing. I've put in my 10,000 hours. I should look in and say, boom, that's what it is. Why am I wasting my time with metrics that could be wrong anyway? So who wants to take that?
Isn't the truth on the 10,000 hour thing that once you reach 10,000, you realize you need 10,000 more? Kind of that truth of, now that I know this,
Now you know what you don't know, right?
I'll take a first step, because I was thinking about this because I particularly love in some of the writing I'm doing, I'm writing about instincts, because I think actually instincts are tremendously important to them, and that there's kind of neuroscience around what instincts are, that where companies tend to view instincts as these kind of flaky little bird things that flit in and out of our life and are unreliable. The truth is that they're much more connected to what's going on. They're kind of a subconscious processing of things. The catch with instincts is on both ends, they have to be fed by something. You don't make, your instincts don't observe things in isolation. the better the metrics are, the better the measurements you have to feed them, the better instincts are. Because I think that in a way, their role is to make connections that surprise us, to detect those things that we don't see. And if we don't have data to do that with, we're kind of stuck. And then at the other end, the challenge with instincts is we very often misinterpret them. So we get some sort of gut that says, oh, yeah, when in fact the gut should have informed us of something else, but our biases and our prejudices and things like that choose us to interpret wrong, and metrics can help us make sure that we're responding correctly. But I mean, that's a first stab at it. JP, you looked excited to
jump in. Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're correct. The value of metrics will depend on context, obviously. But if you're dealing with complexity, you are going to be dealing with exactly what you're describing, which is basically abductive logic, which is the science of hunches, the instinct. Whereas if you're working more with ordered, you're probably going to be working with inductive, deductive reasoning, so traditional logic, basically. But exactly to your point, I mean, it's on one end, things change and people get complacent. So if you only rely on your past experience, which is what people do anyway, but you might get sort of caught out. Not only that, but of course, you are going to be biased in other ways. Human biases are basically heuristics for decisions, and the faster we can get to a decision tends to sort of at least partly be based on what we've done before. But then lastly, of course, you also need to essentially build a case for everyone else in the organization. Going to the CEO and going, I have a really good hunch on this, or about this rather, is not necessarily going to get you to where you need to be. I mean, it's going to be an uphill battle if you don't have any kind of evidence, i.e. data, to back up your claim.
Yeah, and I have to remind people that JP is also a lawyer.
Yeah, well, ex-lawyer. Yeah, I've done legal work in a long time.
So
yes.
The idea of substantiation is ingrained in him. You have to substantiate things, and
Yes.
And you need evidence, right?
Yes, I'm very much evidence-based, as is Andrew.
Yeah, exactly. Well, of course, right. Andrew, comment.
Sure. I think that one of the most important reasons for using metrics is just basic communication. Because I mean, you come into sort of level of definitions and things like that. So you could say, well, I think TV will do really well for us. So, all right, what do you mean? What do you mean by really well? What does somebody else mean by really well? What does really well mean, like in the context of this product, this company, anything? And so, say, well, I think it'll do. As soon as you say, well, I think we'll sell an extra 10,000 units in the second quarter. I say, all right, let's write that down for a start, which is something else that people don't tend to do with their instincts and their hunches. They say, all right, let's write that down and come back to it and see if we were right. And metrics, measurements give you something that everybody can agree on. Hopefully, it's like this is an objective number that we're going to monitor and discuss internally, and if it hits this level, we're going to be happy. If it doesn't hit that level, we're going to be sad, and at least then you can go back and start figuring out about it. So yes, primarily communications and having what you might refer to as closed loop learning. This sort of I studied control engineering at university quite a long time ago, and you have two types of control. You have open loop and closed loop. And open loop control system is you kind of set it without having any sort of feedback from the response. And closed loop is where you say, okay, have an instrument checking the response and feeding it back and saying, is that what we wanted to do? And people have applied this idea to learning as well. So if you do something and then you look at how it turned out and you come back and you adjust your sense. And if you do that for long enough, then you might develop an instinct for it. But it's hard to share that instinct with other people unless you have a common framework and a common language to talk about.
So we have a comment in the chat from Alistair Thompson, who was our wonderful guest last time, and I also highly recommend that you go to the recording of our previous events. There's just been really a couple of very good sessions that even I think it's good, and I highly recommend it. So Alistair was asking about the rear view mirror versus forward-looking metrics. And what is almost by definition, most measurements are about stuff that's already happened, and you're trying to get some predictive quality into them. And there's a lot of complexity right there. Who can speak to that a little bit? Now, we could do that as in the context of really the next topic, which is how should marketing be measured? What is it that is worth measuring? What is it that can be measured? What is it that is useful to measure? What should we not bother measuring? Maybe you can speak to all of the above.
I mean, I'd probably start with the probabilities, because it's, as a strategist, one of my biggest pet peeves is when people say that the essence of strategy is sacrifice. Ogilvy has said this, Porter said that, and so on. The essence of strategy is to move from equiprobability. What that means is basically you're trying to improve the odds of something happening. That means you need to employ probabilistic thinking. And that's where you get into things like the negative Banal distribution and so on. But understanding probabilities of, for example, how your buyer base is going to look or how a system is disposed to act is going to be very, very, very important, at least, from a strategic standpoint. Andrew, any thoughts?
Some. I mean, I'm going to step on your toes and Doug's toes here, I think.
What? Oh, that's okay.
It's a system thinking. It's thinker, rather, that's why.
If you have, you sort of calibrate your idea of how your business is running based on a set of metrics backwards looking. And the accuracy with which they might predict what happens next is related to how much you think your underlying system is changing in the periods between now and then, and looking forward. So, if you were like on a road driving along, and the only instrument that you had in the car that was working was just the rev meter, you could probably, as long as you're on a flat road, you could eventually get a calibration from the rev meter to the speed you were going, more or less. But if you start going downhill or start going uphill, then that connection between your calibrated metric that you had based on past performance and what is going to happen next will be broken. So just in terms of looking forwards, I think it depends on the context of how stable is the business that you're looking at.
I'll comment here.
Oh, go ahead.
Doug, actually, I was going to say that Doug and I share a period when we were both in the world of supercomputing. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's all about scientific engineering, and predictiveness is the name of the game. In fact, so one way that those guys pursue predictiveness is they have a model or they have a theory, and both of them are informed by data. The scientific models, you look at how air flows over wing of an airplane. There are scientific equations that govern that, and they're very complicated and pretty accurate. And you could use that to predict how the wing is going to behave. These days, you use AI, artificial intelligence, to come up with a similar model that tries to be predictive. But in the absence of a really good model and the absence of enough data to create that model, it's going to be probabilistic in a big way. And even after you have all of that, it may still be probabilistic, like JP was saying. Doug, you were going to say?
Well, yeah, I was going to jump in, actually building from that, and building from Andrew's comment. Andrew, you used the word stability. And actually, stable. Stability is one of the key, or it was my entry point into complexity. Way. We don't want to talk about when I was in college. Anyway, it was my entry point into kind of the areas of complexity, because we struggle as human beings to think very clearly about stability. So I agree, the probability question is kind of this key thing. What's fascinating to me is through my career, I've found that some metrics are remarkably stable and some are not. And one of our things going into it and back to predicting is we kind of have to know which of the metrics are most volatile and which metrics are ones that we can rely on. So for example, at some level, I've found that consumer demand is a pretty reliable metric. I mean, the demand in the market, once it's established, tends to be pretty good until something happens. But it's always a noticeable thing. You can always track back to, come on, what's going on, what's happening. A lot of times when my clients would have problems where they see their retail sales, dive, it was actually the retail outlet that had changed, not customers. So the retailer puts them on a bottom shelf, stops using that signage, adds a new sign. Those things are what were driving actual sales, but somehow fundamentally the consumer demand was pretty solid. And I don't know exactly how that interacts with the probabilistic stuff, or what your thoughts might be, Andrew, but I just kind of have gotten to this point where now if a client ever comes to me and says, oh my God, my sales are horrible, I think we've saturated the market. That seems to be the answer usually when sales go down. We must have saturated the market. And the answer is, no, not really. But let's look at your channel and figure out something changed, therefore something in the channel has to change. If things aren't changing, back to Alistair's question, those kind of numbers are fairly reliable for predicting. Others aren't. Like, what's the specific impact of this ad campaign? That gets a lot harder to predict. But I don't know, Andrew, do you have any thoughts? Does that ring any bells for you? Or?
Yeah, so it just escaped from my head what I was about to say. So
we can circle back if it comes back.
We can circle back. There's also a comment about scenario planning as a way of narrowing down the options. And there's also a comment about how metrics might be changing with increasing use of AI.
Yeah, to jump in on scenario planning, the problem with scenario planning is that it works the more ordered a system is, because if you do scenario planning in like broad, big scenario planning in complexity, something comes out of left field and you're basically screwed. So you need to do micro scenario planning, which is a slightly different thing. But in terms of just tailing back to the stuff that changes and doesn't change and so on. So for example, going back to negative binomial distribution, we know that customer bases tend to follow negative binomial distribution. What we cannot predict is what customer is going to buy what, when, and how much. But we can play the odds. We know that you're going to have some buyers who are going to buy you a lot and a lot of buyers who are going to buy you a little. And then you basically improve the odds of success based on that. So you do get the principles about increasing net reach and so on and so forth. So again, you can work around probabilities and better your odds of success without necessarily having to go all the way down into specific predictions, so to say.
I was thinking, Shaheen, back to your and my experience in the past. I think that the unusual thing for us with this question of prediction was in the supercomputer business, we were selling 20 a year, maybe. The quantities were really tiny. So sales forecasting was always kind of this amazing, come to a salesman, I was briefly a salesman, okay, what's your forecast for the year? I don't know. We're talking about these, if the customer buys within this year, my sales forecast is 1. If that customer doesn't buy within the year, my sales forecast is 0. And boy, it's really hard for managers to deal with that style of thing. Once you get larger, like in the consumer market, you've got quantities so that statistics are easier. They just get really harder. And I don't know, JP, I know you've worked with some really specialty companies, so you may have experience with that kind of thing that I haven't really thought that through too much since the days. But
no, I know what you mean. I've worked with both sort of big scale-ups, I suppose one might call them, and some big companies within fintech, but also FMCG. And I think the only answer is that everything is just going to be contextually dependent. For example, if you look at, let's say, the kind of new scale-up that is sort of making the news at the moment. So you have, platforms, for example. And this, by the way, might tie into the next question about what to measure. So for example, you have customer acquisition costs, right? Now, the importance of customer acquisition costs is always going to be quite big. But in a lot of companies such as this, they basically, it's such a huge part of their SG&A that it needs to be sort of balanced again, customer lifetime value, how long you can get someone to stay on your platform, and so on. And you may not have the same concerns necessarily if you're working with an FMCG. And so again, the base metrics might be roughly similar, but everything is going to be contextually dependent, as always.
I'd like to just come back in on something like Doug was saying there, because it's actually very relevant to in lots of ways. and that's your essentially your sample size. So when you don't have very many measurements to make, then your metric is necessarily noisy, and therefore isn't a particularly good predictor. And so, I mean, one example where I saw that sort of in the wild, particularly, was a financial services brand, quite a small one, although it was attached to a bigger company that was better known. And their marketing team was bonused on their awareness and consideration figures that they achieved in the marketplace for their product. And you looked at the data. I think it came from GfK, and it was swinging wildly around. And you're like, well, I mean, I think generally, if an awareness metric is any good, it's pretty much flat. It might be going slightly one way or slightly another way. It's unlikely to be doing that. And same with consideration, really. But once you dug into the data, you'd find that once you'd gone through the screening questions, the difference in like what percentage of people will consider your brand was a difference between 2 or 3 people in a month saying yes, they might consider it. So suddenly you just say, well, this isn't even worth the money that you're spending on the survey to get this. Either you're going to have to spend 10 times as much, because if you're a small brand, you need a much bigger sample to accurately pick up your level. One of the other places you see this is actually just assessing advertising campaigns in general, because you tend to do it once, or do a particular campaign once at a particular time of year. Then you sort of say, well, how did that do? And can I rely on my next campaign doing exactly the same? And well, quite often, no, not really. your sample size of actually the number of campaigns you've done and the number of variables that you put into it. So you say, well, I've done this share of TV and radio and press and outdoor, and I had this creative and that creative, and we were targeting this audience particularly. And then we did a second campaign where we changed everything. Can you tell us which of the factors was the most important in changing the outcome, or something like that? So you always get that sort of statistical anomaly, if you like, where you're often working with pretty sparse information.
I find that a lot as well. Eventually with television, because I was doing direct response television, people would come back and tell us things like, well, we know that 1997 is a far better price than 1999, and we know that through media testing. And eventually my answer became bullshit. That's called testing whispers. Because if you look at TV, outdoor channel at 7:30 a.m. on Wednesday, September 4th, only exists once. And so if that only exists once, what you need is something more like direct mail, where in direct mail you test 5,000, samples to kind of estimate what response rate you might get. Well, 5,000, if that, there aren't 5,000 that Wednesday morning. So you'd have to have a huge number of TV airings before you could begin to conclude anything, and they never did. Television was generally tested because it's so expensive in the direct response world with 20, 25, maybe 40 airings, and there's so much variation, it's really hard to get to statistical, stability. It's almost like, I think, getting down to some of the questions around data, that I think that we still struggle, that there's a lot of marketing metrics that people say, I want this, but lack the sophistication to know that the data, if you get that, is unreliable. So let's collect this. Well, no, don't collect it. I mean, I've started just kind of being, don't collect it if it's not reliable, because it'll just get you in trouble someday. On the other hand, there is really good stuff to be measured and learned about. But
what you often find in all organizations, but in marketing ones in particular as well, people will say, rather than saying, I really want to know this, can I set out to measure it? They will look at whatever they happen to have been collecting anyway and saying, how can we use this? And normally you end up trying to answer a slightly different question, or in some cases a radically different question from the one you'd actually want to ask. And you can put quite a lot of effort into analyzing the thing that you have rather than the thing that you need, and then not really being able to close your loop and making a better decision, because you found out something that isn't what you needed to find out.
Right. Well, kind of two things come to my mind. One is like, what does it cost to measure things? Because you need to have your processes instrumented, or whatever it is, instrumented, sensed, so that the data gets collected and then done accurately, etc. But I work with a lot of startups, and the cost of measurement could be bigger than the cost of, the budget for marketing. So really, the conclusion I have come to is that if you're a Google or a Facebook, by all means, go forth, gather all the data. Everything is already instrumented and you've got, blah, blah, blah. But if you're a startup and you're barely getting the basics in marketing done, maybe measurement isn't for you yet. Now, you can get some analytics for free, but then those come with lots of strings attached, interpretations, they're incomplete, they kind of are worth for what they're worth and not more. So, what is your views on this? Even for bigger companies, I think sometimes they just don't have the right data.
You need to work out what you actually expect to happen. You sort of have an idea about how your world works, what happens or what you think might happen if you pull a lever. So if you say, I'm going to spend this money on a whole bunch of Facebook adverts, and I hope more people will come to my website.
Right.
Okay, that's a reasonable expectation. That's a sense. You can sort of see the causal link there, and you can immediately say, well, I've got a metric that's the number of people that land on my website. I'll set up it's hard to do proper test and control, but you can just maybe compare this month with last month, and then if you turn it off again, compare the month after and say, hey, you know what, we did that, and while it's not conclusive, we can say it looks like that amount of activity drove a 10% uplift in our website visits.
Right.
So you've learned something. So that doesn't have to be expensive, but actually working out what you expect to change, when you expect it to change, how fast it will change, how much it will change by, when it might return to normal once you stop. Writing down all of these sort of outline expectations can suddenly make it gives context to your measurement, and it allows you to do things much more cheaply than saying, well, I need to pay for statistical modeling of this.
Right. Well, the complexity I found there is that it's really hard to establish a baseline because there are so many variables and you just don't have enough time to change them one at a time and see what the impact is. So you end up having to change 5 variables at the same time, and then 5 more, and then 5 more, and then, okay, you got a baseline, but it's really far from, a scientifically valid baseline. And maybe that'll help, but you really never quite know, right?
Can I take leaping off from that? Because there's I want to throw this your way, JP, in a second here to kind of pose it, which is, I think part of what we deal with is that the metrics available, especially in the digital space, tend to be very far removed from what we want to know. Right. So we measured somebody clicked on this. We measured somebody saw this. We measured, a few people bought that were trackable from this. But we have broader things we're trying to have happen. And so I think, JP, I was going to throw it your way because I think, strategically, you have to be looking at marketing as this whole. And metrics, one of the dangers of metrics is they're so reducible that people get focused on the little chunks. But what we need to know at an executive level is how do they add up?
Yes, I mean, I think that's very true. I think a huge problem is that a lot of companies will measure just because they can, as opposed to the stuff that they actually need to measure. Going back to what Andrew was talking about before as well, I mean, there is a problem with language. We tend to perceive or believe at least that everyone else has the same definitions for all these metrics that we're talking about, whether that's effectiveness, efficiency, ROI, whatever it might be. The problem is that most, or at least a lot of companies and even sort of purveyors of metrics, they all have various differing definitions of these metrics. So it's not just about identifying the metrics that we do want or do need, but it's also understanding that, are we using the same language when we're looking at these metrics or not? And oftentimes that's hugely ignored. So the marketing effectiveness discourse, for example, suffers from this greatly. We're just talking past one another. And I'll throw this to Andrew because he and I have been working on this particular thing, but it's been something quite eye-opening for me, at least. Andrew, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's the choice. I mean, you get into the sort of choice of metric stuff, and you get into your I still come back to sort of trying to understand how exactly you, in a broad sense, do you know how your company makes money? In a general sense, I mean, like, is your brand one that makes money because you can charge more for it, and that changes your choice of metric. You say, okay, well, I want to protect price elasticity rather than I want to protect, more than I'm looking for short-term sales. Or is are you selling stuff the cheapest, in the market? In which case, you maybe don't want to advertise, you're just going to lead entirely on price, and therefore actually volume out the door matters more. If you're like an insurance aggregator site where actually traffic is everything, then you say, well, what drives traffic? And so your choice of metric in all of these situations just changes, and you need to pick the metric that suits you and what you're trying to do, and actually having agreement from everybody else in your sort of level that that this is how we make money, and therefore this is what's important to track. And you can reduce your number of metrics right the way down and say, well, that doesn't matter for my business, that doesn't matter for my business, this is the only one that I want to check. And then you Doug and JP are much more into the strategy than I am, but once you have something that you think is important as a metric, you can adjust your strategy to say, okay, how do we support this? Does this fit? Or is this just how it is at the moment, and your strategy is that you want to move away from that? If you don't want to be relying on being the cheapest in the market anymore, then you say, all right, well, there are some fundamental changes that you have to make. We have to stop measuring what we used to measure and measure something else. Sorry, did that answer the question?
Yeah, no, but I think you're right. I think that it's an interesting interplay between the strategy and the metrics that you use, because of course, strategy ultimately, again, is about moving from equiprobability. It's a lot to do with problem solving, or managing problems at least. And then understanding the correct metrics to use will basically tell you whether you're doing a good job or not. Then, of course, if you tie that back to the business model and the core of the business strategy, then exactly to your point, Andrew, sometimes you might change that because all of a sudden you make a strategic shift or whatever it might be. But similarly, if you're working within complexity, basically, you need to ask yourself 3 different questions, right? So the first thing you ask yourself if you work in complexity is, first of all, what can I change, right? If you want to change something, what can I change? And then the second question becomes, among all these things, where can I monitor the impact? So there you start looking at metrics. And then, of course, after that, then once you're monitoring that impact, you need to figure out, okay, so where can I amplify stuff that needs amplifying or dampen the stuff that needs dampening? And you're continuously, obviously, working the data there. So again, it's sort of an interplay back and forth between strategy and metrics and so on.
Well, I was going to say, just to get to kind of a wrapping the closure around this issue of relying on the things you can rather than the things you should. That if all you're getting back are the metrics that are easily available, and I've been involved in a lot of education issues, and this is a failing in education fairly often. But if you're relying on what you can measure, the problem is it can really mislead you into strategic errors because you don't know. I mean, as Andrew's talking about narrowing, so you know what kinds of decisions can you make based on this data. It can lead you to, and I've seen some incredible, errors on client parts where they're misunderstanding the metric, and therefore they go make massive business decisions without understanding what's going on. I think that, just to throw one other thing here, is I would like to come back to the fact that we're dealing with an overall. And I ran into that a lot when I was doing direct response television, because the only reason we did television for people was it was a combination of the direct sales were nice, because we would like to get direct sales off of TV. But we were doing this as a way to provide effective television advertising that affected all of their sales channels. So something like advertising is having to have an impact across a lot of things, but people get distracted. And I had one client who made their dashboard up, and direct response sales was an item on the dashboard that was separate from everything else. And at some point they called me up. They're like, oh my God, our direct response sales are going down. We got a real problem here. Does that mean we've saturated the, classic saturated the market question and all that stuff? And I'm like, no, what's going on? And it took us a while to get the data out of them. And what you found was direct response sales started to go down at exactly the same time that the number of stores at Home Depot they were in would increase. And so what you were seeing was the natural result of Home Depot expanding, and the overall result was a far better sales record than they would have had by focusing only on the direct response part. But because they isolated them as separate metrics, they weren't looking at the picture and saying, back to Andrew's question, what makes your company tick? What makes your company successful? They had isolated it into each of these things with the idea of, well, we'll just manage each of these things separately. And, the old, if they're all healthy, then we're healthy, which probably fits into the Deming warning about managing by metrics can lead to the perfectly managed company that fails.
Right.
Because but he does mean managing by metrics, as opposed to, this is the last thought I'll end here, which is metrics are just a tool. Right. They're only a tool, and they're a really important tool. But we're in charge, not the metrics. And I see a lot of companies get that backwards. Well, right. We've got to keep the metrics happy. Quick, feed the metrics, and somehow it gets all out of whack. And all of a sudden you look around and, you got an entire company full of people who are slaves to metrics instead of, making their own choices.
There's a comment about how you must also look at the life cycle of a brand, and the needs are different. But then that is a segue into something that I heard JP say in a different talk, where he was saying, I hope I'm quoting you right, that when things change, what you measure needs to change. If your competition suddenly does something, or if your product roadmap suddenly changes. So you also have to look at all of the dynamics of the situation that guides what you measure and how you interpret it. So let's talk a little bit about that, on how changes can impact what you measure and how you interpret.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the key thing, again, obviously I'm biased, but goes back to the strategy. If you are making a strategic shift, you might prioritize different things. And, this can be, to your example, or the question, the life cycle stages. So if you're a startup, you tend to sort of sell to make, in a sense. You're trying to just increase cash flow so you can actually just survive. And then, of course, as you grow, you switch to make to sell, which is when you're starting to essentially try to become profitable. So yes, that does indeed change over time. And it becomes, again, going back to my comment to Andrew's previous point about, the strategy and the metrics and how they sort of interact with one another. Yes, what's most important to you is probably likely going to change. If you're, scaling up a company, growth is going to be really important. You want to at least create an illusion of growth. So, customer acquisition will be your top priority. Over time, someone, VC or whoever else, will ask you to provide a sort of a path to profit, if you will. So, so maybe we need to try some different things and increase the dwell time on our platform, or the amount of purchase that customer make using our product, whatever it might be, or services. So yes, it does, absolutely, it does change over time.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it even changes within a specific project. My students, I force them to do a first marketing plan, and they're in the midst of doing these right now. And one of the questions is, how are you going to know that it's succeeded? And I have them split it between measured and unmeasured, or measured and qualitative, or other kinds of measures. But I also have them split it between short and long term, because my experience in a company is you take on a big new direction, and within a month, the CEO's at your desk saying, has it worked? Dude, we got to wait 6 months before we're going to really know if this worked. And so the question is, what things, even within the context of a project, the metrics you might use early on, which might be buzz metrics or search metrics, there's a bunch of stuff, there's been a bunch of discussion on marketing Twitter about whether search metrics can be used as a proxy for brand interest, and stuff like that. But, so there are metrics you can track in the short term and kind of go, yeah, looks like it's working. But you won't really know for, 6 to 8 months, because you have to see it affect a lot more things before you can really declare success.
I mean, this is where we need to lob in to Andrew, because he's got some really interesting views on short versus long.
Oh, good.
He's just waiting to jump in now.
You're trying to get me in trouble, JB.
No, me? Never.
I won't go into all of it. Some of it's been written up elsewhere. I think a real bugbear of mine in marketing, and it happens a lot, and in fact it happened to me on a client debrief last week, is that if a marketing activity obviously hasn't worked, there'll be a group of people saying, don't worry, it's building the brand. It's like, Yeah, I know you can't see any change. You know, I know you can't see anything, but trust me, it's building the brand. And you're suddenly into sort of unfalsifiable logic. It's like, so the less you can see, the more it's doing secretly. You know,
I was going to say we're familiar with that in the U.S. right now in government, but
so I'm much more attached to the idea, and I think that there's quite a lot of evidence for it. If it doesn't have a short-term effect of whatever size, it almost certainly doesn't have a long-term effect. You know, because whatever it is that you did, somebody is in your category buying today or tomorrow, and they will have seen it. And if seeing an advert fresh made not a blind bit of difference to their purchase decision, then the chances of them waking up 6 months from now and, you know, thinking about it at that point are pretty slim. So then you sort of say, well, how, you know, I'm not saying there's not a long-term effect, but there's other ways that you would try and estimate that. I think the JP mentioned a few of them, sort of like customer lifetime value. And once you say, all right, well, we can scale up our short-term acquisitions, our new customer acquisitions, by a sort of lifetime value, then that frees you up a little bit to say, okay, let's look at the short term. How do we acquire more customers in the short term? You know, I want to sell my product tomorrow. You know, it's never a bad thing, at least unless you're slashing the price of it and forcing it into somebody's hand and making a loss. It's not a bad thing to sell your product tomorrow rather than in 6 months or 3 years' time. So.
Yeah, you know, the funny thing in advertising I've found with that, Andrew, is that because we direct response, we're measuring right away. First thing I've found that's unusual, that it's like, I wish my brand compatriots would actually just hear it, hear the story and ponder it, is that when we would put a 60-second spot on air, the first few airings, or, you know, a first set, the first week and a half, we're within 25% of where that spot was going to perform over its lifetime. It's not huge change from that point. And yet you'd always have people saying, yeah, but maybe if we just keep it on air, it'll double. And the answer is no, it doesn't do that. You know, it just doesn't do that. So I think that, you know, it's kind of I mean, I absolutely agree if you're not seeing that. And so when I have my students do a short term, I think it really is important to start measuring some effects short term. There are effects that we need to, you know, that are maybe indirect, like excitement in the market or mentions here, or, you know, that sometimes those are the things to measure. But ideally, yeah, an ad should have an impact, and we you know, hopefully we can air it at a large enough rate to measure the impact. Where it got really tough in television is you know, I did a lot of work with Lowe's. In order to be able to say that impact came from television, we needed $1 million budget for media, you know, because otherwise, you know what? Everything washes out. You can't read it, you can't see it. And it's not that it didn't have an effect. It may have had a perfect effect. You just can't prove it. And people want proof so much that it's really tough. I mean, this puts a marketer in a really tough position, because if you think, well, I think it worked, but, you know, it's an interesting one about with the complexity of causation that Thomas just put in. Between variables that act probabilistic, aren't all marketing measures proxies at best? Yes.
Some of them are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think most of them are, because ultimately the ultimate marketing measure is revenue and margin. Mm-hmm. And if you think of it that way, well, then unless you're measuring revenue and margin, everything else is a proxy. Mm-hmm. And you know, then you better understand the relationship between them and how it's all changing. There's also a comment on pre-testing and pre-testing messages. Maybe this is all a good segue into another topic, which is, and we're kind of approaching the top of the hour where we said we're going to end, although I'm happy to go over if people want to go over. How do you know you're doing it right? And, you know, how do metrics kind of contribute to creating complexity versus helping reduce complexity? Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But if there are any rules of thumb or any litmus tests that tell you that you're doing it right, maybe we can cover those.
I mean, you should never don't expect to do it right. Just try and be less wrong is quite a good, you know, especially when, you know, as you know, we're talking about complexity. You know, everything's changing. You know, even if you had perfect information for the decision you made yesterday, that same decision will not be perfect tomorrow because something has changed that you didn't know about. And you might find out about it in hindsight, but you don't know. So there's a lot of how do I how do I become more consistent? You know, and I think JP and Doug sort of both spoke to this. You know, there's you try and get you try and maximize the probability that the thing you're doing is right, and there's no guarantee that that's going to pay off. So one example that I've used in the past is there was a football game here a few years ago. I think it was Swansea versus Man United in the first game of the season. And Swansea beat Man United 3-0 or something like that. Something horrendous anyway. I probably not got that quite right, as I'm not really a football person. But the point is, if you had to build a system to predict football results, then a good system would have got that that particular result wrong, you know, because sometimes stuff just happens. If you calibrated your predictions to get that result right, chances are all the other forecasts and the rest of the games would be wrong. So it's one of those things that just because something did happen doesn't mean it's likely to happen, which is kind of like can be a little mind bending at times. So you have to bear that in mind, that you're trying to maximize the probability of success, but you can't guarantee success for any number of reasons.
Right. Unless it's an ordered system, like JP was saying earlier, where it is linear and predictive and all that.
Yeah, it doesn't happen in marketing.
Sales. What's it?
But
it's a lot harder. Hey, let me ask. I want to throw in a question kind of towards all three of you around one of the things that struck me as I was pondering our topic today is that metrics aren't prescriptive, right? Metrics are quality. They'll tell us if we're on the right path, if we're not on the right path. I mean, you can use metrics to understand where these measurable things are going. But one of the things I found in DRTV a lot was that people would say, well, the spot didn't work. And the question was, why? Oh, well, we have no clue about that. You know, we don't have any way to get at the answer of why it didn't work. So a lot of times metrics will leave us without an answer to, so what do we do different? Is that fair? Or, I mean, and I don't mean that that's absolute, but I do think it's kind of a challenge in metrics that, you know, the more we rely on metrics, the less we know about why people act or what moves people to take a choice. Or
I'll say something quickly. This is showing up a lot in artificial intelligence because, you know, if you've defined the scope within which you're trying to automate things very precisely, then you can gather the data, and then you can soon find out just how much data you need before you can be predictive. And it turns out the data you need is a lot more than you thought you did. Like everybody in the beginning thought that with a couple of thousand pictures of cats, you could predict cats. It turns out that a couple of thousand, not only is it not enough, even 100,000 isn't enough. That you need like literally several million pictures of cats before you can, you know, when it comes to natural language processing, they're like literally, you know, exabytes of, and they're still not quite able to do it. So the amount of data you need before you can be predictive in the absence of a scientific mathematical model is really quite formidable. And therefore, you know, like, you know, it's a sample size, back to what Andrew was saying.
I think there's something in what Doug was saying. It's like, no one makes you be a slave to metrics. You know, metrics don't have agency. Metrics don't in themselves tell you anything. It's how you embed metrics within your decision-making process. It's how you understand them and the system that they have, the data has arisen from. You know, there is a single real-world system ticking along, and every so often we stick an instrument in and we get some data out at that point, and then we try and make sense of it with a view to understanding that underlying system a little bit better. Now, in most cases, that system, you might say it's a technical term is underdetermined. I think that you could not recreate the system based on the amount of data that you have. You know, you would need thousands, millions times more data to correctly create a model of an accurate model of the underlying system. You know, with the data. So you can only ever use your metrics in combination with what you have either on your own or collectively or whatever figured out as the most likely causal model that is ticking along out of sight. And then your data should feed you some sort of information about that in combination with your model. Now, it might turn out that you get so much data that tells you a particular thing that you're like, I just realized I don't understand this thing that I thought worked like this clearly doesn't, because I'm now collecting too much data that tells me I'm wrong consistently. Or a lot of the time it's like, all right, this kind of fits within my worldview. It's like price elasticity is 1 point or minus 1.5. It's not minus 74. You can sort of say that. And it's almost a Bayesian thing. You have your own priors, your own expectations, and then the data comes in, and to some extent it reinforces or refutes your priors.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. The thing is, if you're working with a complex adaptive system, the only way to model it is if the model is the system itself. Basically, you cannot model a complex adaptive system. But you can look at plausible connections, and then exactly to Andrew's point, you can again start to work with probabilities and improve the odds of success. And there's a hell of a difference, as a former colleague of mine once said, of being 90% correct 90% of the time and being 100% correct 10% of the time. And even a 99% probability of something happening is, you can still be wrong, but you're just continuously trying to improve, understand how the system is disposed, and then again, just improve the odds of success. And bit by bit, if you do it correctly, you should learn, and then you improve, and then you build, and on it goes.
Right.
I think there's an interesting value in small bits of data that they're not good for building a full case of what's going on, but they can often correct our misperceptions. So, and this one's qualitative, but I'm going to use it anyway, which is we were working with a company that sold metal detectors on TV. Well, actually, they didn't sell them. They just got catalog orders. So they had people call in for catalog, and they were all wrapped up in their brand. Our brand's the reason people are calling. So we got 35 names, I think. And somebody on my staff called them out of my basement offices, because it's back when we were in the basement of my house, And so she called him, and those 35 were enough to figure out, because she called and said, I'm calling on behalf of, and with the brand. And they'd all say, who? And as she processed it, what we figured out is they weren't being moved by the ad because they wanted this company. They were being moved by the ad because they've been sitting around saying, I'm going to get me one of them metal detectors someday. And then the ad shows up and they go, hey, I'll call for a catalog. And, it was a really interesting, it was a small thing that helped us really, but you can't rely on those happening necessarily, because if we'd done that survey and that hadn't showed up, we wouldn't have, there still could be huge problems out there. But sometimes it does correct us when we see little bits of data that don't fit with our expectations.
I mean, it's quite important that, the sort of classic is, the theory of evolution. Now, you can't actually prove the theory of evolution, but you could disprove it. All you need is some sort of creature dug up in the wrong strata in some rock, and that just doesn't belong anywhere, doesn't fit, and suddenly say, "Whoa, this you can falsify a theory with quite a small amount of data." And as it happens, we've never done that. So it remains unfalsified, if you like.
Dinosaurs are my favorite example, though, Andrew. Right? I mean, when I was growing up, dinosaurs were reptiles that lived isolated, lonely lives, and
cold-blooded.
Now all of a sudden they're flocking birds.
Well, I mean, that's the thing as well, is that the theory of evolution does not necessarily take into account what's called exaptation, which is when you see a sort of radical repurposing of an existing technology. I mean, to your point about birds and dinosaurs, if dinosaurs merely evolved to become birds, because, well, basically they were falling off of trees. Now, they wouldn't have been able to breed properly. So probably what happened is that they evolved to have feathers, for example, due to the weather getting colder. And then all of a sudden one of them fell off a tree and noticed that, oh, actually the feathers could be used for something else. And similarly, if you look at the sort of history of invention, you see that, for example, the microwave was invented by just sheer coincidence, same with the penicillin and so on. And those kinds of changes are really, really difficult to forecast. There are going to be massive disruptions in the market, but they're really difficult to sort of see before they happen, so to say.
Just to be clear, too, I was not challenging the theory of evolution, Andrew.
No.
It's really more, I've been fascinated as an example of when data can mislead us. Because in the 1960s, the paleontologists were working with the absolute best data available and making theories of what they thought that meant. And between 1960 and 2000, massive numbers of things were discovered that changed it all because they just hadn't discovered them yet. So these days, I'm getting very skeptical when people give me big historical things like, well, this is what humans were doing in 10,000 BC. And I'm like,
but I mean,
Well,
it also, so just to say, I think it ties the entire chat together this past hour in a sense that when you're talking about, you know, creationism versus Darwinism or whatever it might be, it's often worth asking yourself, how is it that I know what I know? I mean, do I really know what I know, or do I just think I know? And metrics kind of are the same to a degree in the sense that if someone asks you if the marketing you're doing is working, how can you actually prove that? You know, how do I know that the marketing that I'm doing is working or not? And you know, that's similar. So yeah, just ties the entire thing together, I'd say.
It does, yes. Yes, it also brings the expertise that we started out with, and the instinct is that maybe what we need is a combination of experts interpreting data because they will do it with a more considered hand. And in terms of knowing, I just think of it concentric circles. There are things that we know that we know. There are things that we have a pretty good hunch. There are things that we think it's likely. And then there are things that we're just probing, but we don't. And there are things that we just don't know.
I thought you were
And
going full Rumsfeld there, Shane.
I know.
that's true, right.
Rick Nason makes a point.
But actually,
Rumsfeld's embarrassing moment. Actually, the quote's pretty good. But it was Rumsfeld, so you know.
well, that was the whole unknown known unknowns. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about a linear spectrum of knowledge.
Right.
There are things that we absolutely are sure of. We know 2 + 2 = 4, and we know under what conditions that may not be the case. So we really, really know that. But then you go from here to like outer, you know, edges of things, then the level of confidence drops, and you know, maybe there are zones in there that can guide us. And you know, and that's really why a lot of the social problems are our best guess. This is like our best odds. You got to go with what science says right now, and you know, they may be wrong, but at the time, that's our best bet.
Yeah, Tom Claret asked up above about, you know, stuff like how do you know the impact of a TV spot? And, you know, I can't tell you all that stuff. What I can say for our work is when we did our work with Lowe's, we would sell 1 million units of a hand tool in 2 months leading up to Christmas, a hand tool that hadn't been on the shelf before. That's what they would sell out the door. We also know that on the other extreme, that if they just put it in the store with the best in-store support possible, they would only sell 150,000. You know, I mean, the guys there know this stuff. So what we have is this difference of, okay, it would have been 150,000. We did TV, it was 2 million. I can't explain all the details in between. I mean, I can't give you all that. All I can say is they wouldn't have gotten to 1 million without TV.
Right.
You know, I can't say that it was specifically 546,000, you know, 300.
Well, you know, in the B2B space, and as you probably guys know better than I do, it needs something like 5-6 touches before some conversion happens. So then which one of those touches takes credit for it is just not a good question, because they all take credit for it.
Yeah.
And this is really what happens like in a sales situation where you come up with a lead and like the sales guy say, well, I already knew them and I already talked to them. And that's true. And you know, and they did. But these other 5 touches is really what hopefully help move it forward.
I ran into that all the time in marketing departments because you'd have TV, print, internet, right? All these different, and everybody wanted to claim victory for themselves. And it was always this, well, who's responsible? And to some degree,
it's a coalition.
X. And to some degree, a lot of times we would know, I mean, our work had a certain power. On the other hand, it couldn't be that powerful without these other things. So you're kind of, it's everything, you know. But,
now, isn't that how you should come up with the marketing mix?
So go ahead.
Please, I just said, yeah. Isn't that how you should come up with a marketing mix?
Yeah. It is, but politics make that tough. So.
Yeah, no, but I was just going to say that a friend of mine, he was talking about Google Analytics and the Google Analytics dashboard. And that can be very much sort of last click attribution, because of course, what it presumed at that time when everyone turned them on and saw all these sales was that, you know, the day before those sales just did not exist. There were no baseline, but all, you know, along comes Google and all of a sudden it's all attributed to these digital media campaigns, which of course is just horseshit.
That's a really good point.
There was a Wyden & Kennedy here submitted their Old Spice social media campaign for an Effie award. And I read the Effie award and they said, well, look at this. There was nothing, massive sales, our ads really, really great. except I knew. And then they said, no, there was a specific question. Was there anything important going on at the same time? And they said, no. Well, I happen to know there were two things, which is the exact creative they used in that social campaign first aired on the Super Bowl that year. So there's about $5 million worth of nothing going on. And then the other part was that there was a good study that showed that everybody who had done couponing had seen sales go up that year, and everybody who hadn't had seen sales not go up. And Old Spice was one of those who did couponing. So when they claimed all those sales for themselves, it was like, but this happens anymore. I think this is what drives marketing execs crazy, because people come back with this, well, see, it was the, when in fact, it's a layered, complex thing, a lot of stuff affecting each other. And you have to figure out which stuff to kick out and keep in, but it's not always clear.
Right. You've got an issue with incentives for your marketing team. If ever you have a sort of economic difficulty, it's almost certainly incentives are at the root misaligned. So the incentive of having an FE for a marketing manager or an agency vastly outstrips any sort of objective use for saying, oh, but we did our measurement really, really well and fairly, and it's extremely boring and quite standard. There's a lot of advertising on, I'd much rather have the FE and the promotion,
Well, the incentives are metrics too.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's the point. I mean, me and Andrew, we do go into that a fair bit in the Castlin manifesto this year, but it is exactly your point. There are so many incentives. I'm not sure. Well, you guys are Americans. You probably remember the Colin Kaepernick campaign from a couple of years ago. And there's a sort of big debate on that and how good it was. And it was, changed. It was 31% of all the Nike sales and this, that, and the other. And it was responsible for Nike's stock price. But of course, what had happened was that the stock price had gone up for about half a year, and then they ran the campaign. It kept going for a couple of days, and then it plummeted. But it was also launched a couple of days after Labor Day weekend, when of course people don't shop online because they have to spend time with their families, which basically means that sales go up every year at that time. And compared to the previous year, it was a difference of about 14% on their online sales in the US, but it's 31% of all the sales. Not really. And they also forgot to mention that they launched a massive product extension as well. I think it was something to do with Michael Jordan. So, again, you have a lot of people taking credit for a lot of things that perhaps they shouldn't take credit for. And that can be on the creative side. That can be all those, people delivering the metrics because they want to look good. It can be, insert thing here, basically.
I'm going to give a brief boost for, I just last week got a copy of a book by this guy, Kevin Hillstrud, who is a direct marketing catalog kind of guy that also was at Nordstrom's. And what I was really interested in is the books rely heavily on metrics. So they're tremendously refreshing because he's actually talking about metrics, but also always over several years, which is good. And they're really just, they're tiny little booklets, they're not thick. So I don't think he's trying to make a lot of money with this. I think they're around his stuff, but they're actually really quite, I was quite surprised because there's actually tables about metrics and showing how we misled ourselves with this metric and what was really going on. And so if anybody wants to do a little, they're cheap and easy reading, 40, 50 pages.
Good point there. Good point.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to say, and maybe this is like another meeting, is what you said, Doug, about this is part of the overall thing. So one of my pet peeves and problems really, when I play CMO or when I play just a consultant, is that different parts of marketing do not see themselves as part of marketing. PR sees itself as mainly because they've got a direct route to senior execs and they get to mingle with them separately. They sometimes don't see themselves as an integral part of marketing. Advertising doesn't see themselves as, and that's why they say marketing does that. And I'm saying, but you are part of marketing. How can you say marketing did that? You could say, we did that. So I think that's another part of the problem here is that, they're incented to take credit for because they feel themselves outside of marketing.
I think so. And yeah, because people, I'm a little thread I'm fascinated about is that marketing is defined differently in every company you go to. And it's one of the things that makes it so confusing for students. And so I've started talking about that in a sense that what I'm going to teach you is marketing. And no matter where you go, you're going to just see a marketing department that has a piece of that. And then within the marketing department, you've still got other little pieces that are fighting with each other. And
All right.
it's difficult in, so who's in charge of consumer research? And these days, far too many engineering departments are. And that scares the hell out of me, to be honest. But,
Yeah,
They're not
so
letting
this does
engineers
want to
talk
be.
to people, are they, Doug?
What's that, Andrew?
They're not letting engineers talk to people, are they? That's catastrophic.
Unfortunately, they're not only letting them talk to people, but they're letting them conclude that they understand the subtleties of human behavior.
This is one of the sort of weird ironies I find on Twitter sometimes. Is I'm from an engineering background, and I will often be arguing the side of hey, marketing is really complex. It's difficult. You can't have simple rules that apply in all circumstances. You've got to really take your time and research. And you get marketers saying, no, it's dead easy. We've got the long and the short of it. It's 40%. That's fine. It's just really sort of backwards. If anyone should be bigging up how hard their job is, you think it'd be the marketers. But
that's true. That's really funny. I made the full shift from because I was originally in engineering and then went to marketing. And there's a fair number of engineers I've run into that are really quite surprised because I really am a marketing guy. And they're used to the engineer with a patina of marketing. And when I finally moved from supercomputers to $3 sponges with O-Cedar, it was like, I'd arrived. So
There's a question about your Lamborghini, Doug.
Which model did we agree on?
No, he's been being overly kind to me. And the mini book that I've just finished, a sub-chapter of which Andrew was very kindly offering to and did actually end up as well co-writing it and making it a whole lot better than it ever would have been without him. But
that's
anyway.
Brilliant. In fact, there's a question on how they can find your manifesto, JP, this year.
It will be available via Substack to purchase via subscription to my newsletter. So you can be either $5 if you want to, or as much as you like to pay above that.
Very well, excellent. So this could be also a good segue to ask every one of you with some other comments about this, and then how people can get more of you.
Well, I'll start. You can find me easiest on Twitter at JP Castlin. You can also find me via my website, which is jpcastlin.com, and my newsletter, which is Strategy in Praxis. So that's praxis with an X, not practice. .substack.com.
There's two ways to stay in touch with me. I've got a blog at the cleverly named douggarnett.com. But you can also follow me on Twitter, where I am Atomic Adman. So Atomic Adman, which I closed the company Atomic, but I love the name so much, I'm sticking with it.
Andrew, how about yourself? How can we reach you, get more of you, and any thoughts?
No, you've had all my thoughts. I've run dry. But you can normally find me on Twitter arguing with somebody or other. So I'm not promising I'm on the right side of the argument, but I'll at least believe I'm on the right side of the argument. So that's at AJ Willshire. I'll stick that in there as well. I've got a website which is slightly out of date and needing improved, and that's at diametrical.co.uk.
That's great. That's right. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And if you if you really want more of me, then I'm always available for hire.
Exactly. That's right.
Happy to chat at any point.
I think we must ask you about your critique of ROI, before we conclude.
Do we have another hour?
Yeah. You want to have a comfort break first? It's just a really bad metric, and for a whole range of reasons, which you can probably find me online talking about. But we've known it's been a really bad metric to measure advertising by for 20 years. Our articles have been written 20 years ago saying this is a bad metric, and somehow we've managed to. The only thing we've ever managed to train clients to do is to care about ROI. And I think that's a damning indictment of the marketing industry, that we've managed to train so many people to think about the wrong thing. and we're probably going to have to spend 40 years untraining them if we ever do. So
Yeah, I think that it's like the danger with ROI is it's what every executive wants to know. And I find this in marketing research all the time when we're doing like surveys. You know, a client will come in and say, well, my CEO called and he wants to know, and ask a very specific question. And so here's the questionnaire I've put up, and the questionnaire has a few qualifiers, the question, and then a bunch of other stuff, without any recognition that you cannot get people to answer in your language. They want to, you know, the only way to actually learn this, if you said, hey, I want to learn this, then you're going to go off into a whole, you know, myriad of ways to understand people in order to find it out. And in research, we can deliver an answer to you, but you can't ask that question literally. And I think ROI, it just is the magic question every CEO wants to know. And so everybody says, oh yeah, I can tell you that.
Yeah.
Because
Well, you know, it goes in kind of our end of the business, it goes well with TCO, total cost of ownership, which is a similarly flawed metric, because usually when people say TCO, I'm saying, well, how long do you expect to stay in business? Because that would be your total cost of ownership. So maybe that can be added to to the ROI discussion. So thank you for you being generous with your time, our wonderful panelists. Thank you for the audience for still being there. Thank you all. Until next time. Take care.
All right.
thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.